Stuff like this makes me cranky. In particular, the fact that there's Master of Historical Fencing in the title. And then this is what we're seeing. Let's talk about it. There are a number of events similar to this, where you have guys in full armor bash the crap out of each other with swords. And I'm okay with it if it's presented accordingly. Anachronistic, this and that, or whatever, a spin-off of MMA, things of that nature, okay. If it's presented as historical, that's where I have a problem with it. This, you can maybe call it like historically inspired. The title of this video here, you can tell, is written with clickbait in mind. You know, Master of Historical Fencing, Knight versus Samurai, they know what gets the clicks. And it's just a misrepresentation. I mean, look at the Knight here. All he does is this. Chop down, chop down, chop down, chop down. The other guy in the samurai armor actually parries. Like, he actually tries to block and parry and do different things. The knight guy, zero concern for defense. He's like, yep, I've got armor. I mean, fair enough. It would be pretty difficult to damage this kind of armor with a katana or really just about any sword by just hacking at it. We have sources for it. We know if you have a sword, you don't just bash away at the armor. You try to exploit the gaps, whether it be cutting into the joints, for example, or other gaps, or thrusting into them, or whatever. I mean, percussive strikes to the helmet make a certain amount of sense. That is still effective in the real world. Labeling this Master of Historical Fencing is almost irresponsible. I say almost because what I consider irresponsible is teaching people completely bogus self-defense techniques and fooling them into believing that they're ready for a street fight. That is straight up irresponsible. That can get people hurt. This is just, it'll misinform people. It's not as big of a deal, but still bothers me. You know, it's still not good. Now, when we think about historical combat, there are a lot of things we don't know, like straight up. We can't know exactly what a battlefield looked like. We know who was positioned where and how. We know troop compositions and what sort of equipment they were wearing and what weapons they're carrying, etc., etc., all of this. We know like general tactics. There are a lot of things we know, but we don't know the exact way it went down. We don't know the techniques that were being used, if any. It's fair to assume that in the midst of battle, a lot of people would just revert to very basic stuff. And I have no doubt that there would be a lot of just frantically chopping down, and there wouldn't be as much fancy technique going on, and particularly also depending on who's involved. If it's commoners, if it's drafted peasants, of course, they wouldn't really know fancy techniques or anything. Although we need to be careful even with statements like that. There are many examples of martial arts practice in cultures all over the world, which are not a social elite. From Nordic wrestling to Polish stick fighting, there are plenty of examples that show that commoners engaged in this too, even if there were no hoity-toity manuscripts about them funded by nobility. Just because we don't have written sources doesn't mean they didn't do it. There may very well have been an entirely separate class of common folk martial arts. We know that peasants owned weapons for self-defense, and it stands to reason that they would try to find some time to practice using them. Knights were trained from a young age, so it's easy to assume that knights would still use actual techniques on the battlefield because they've just been drilled for thousands of hours over many years. It would be second nature to them. So, and this isn't even a battlefield situation. This is a one-on-one. This is a duel. Dueling techniques are kind of on the opposite extreme. Like, we can't assume that all the fancy stuff we see, like every technique, we see shown in the historical manuscripts that that's what they did all the time, that's what everybody did. No, of course not. This is a very specific scenario. These are usually talking about judicial duels. In some cases, also self-defense on the street. And some of these manuscripts acknowledge that there were people referred to as buffalo in the German manuscripts who would just use brute strength and would just swing down hard and just didn't know these nuances. So fair enough, we shouldn't take that and go the opposite extreme and be like, yeah, everybody was like super fancy, highly skilled swordsmen. Oh, obviously not. There were some people definitely in the bash them until they don't move anymore camp, and there were people who knew more and anything in between. And also I totally understand fighting in armor like this, particularly since typically the armor that's made for events like this is usually thicker than actual historical armor that they used back in the day to minimize the risk of injury. You know, if you bash each other hard like this with swords that usually are heavier than what they used in historical times, and yeah, you need more protection. So this is hard work, right? So you'll get exhausted, especially with this kind of helmet where you have limited airflow, you can't breathe as well. This guy in the full night getup, he's working hard and he must have been panting, and this is tough. And the more tired you get, the more you revert to basic stuff because you just don't have the energy for a lot of fancy movements. It's like, okay, one more. You know, I get that. That's a thing. But still, right from the start, there's nothing going on other than just chop, 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 the old Pac-Man. And there's so much more to historical fighting, particularly if you want to call it master of historical fencing. Fencing, this is not fencing, this is choppity chop. That's a very different thing. There are a number of different elements that go into martial arts. There's distance control, there's timing, there's knowledge of which technique beats which. There are feints, redirecting, there's defensive actions, there are static blocks, there are deflectional parries, there are so many different things, there are thrusts. We see none of that. The only thing we see is downward cut, downward cut, downward cut. So please, for the love of steel, don't do this kind of thing. Okay, be aware of what you're doing and the limitations involved. If this is the kind of thing you want to do, have fun with it. That's all fine and good. Like, take a note from the SCA. They're calling themselves Society of Historical Anachronism. Okay, they're acknowledging, yeah, this is not strictly historical. This is historical inspired. So yeah, just had to get that off my chest. I really hate seeing stuff like this. It's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. Again, it doesn't directly endanger anyone. I mean, arguably, participating in events like this brings a certain risk, so they are in somewhat of danger. But you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't expose other people unwillingly and unknowingly to risk. So it's fairly benign as far as misinformation goes, but we don't need it. Come on. All right? Anyway, thanks for watching. Have a good one. Take care. Be safe.